It's a great pleasure for me to be here with you in Montreal. Thank you very much for this great invitation.
And the PowerPoint will be available to you later, and there are references to many of the things that I'll be talking about. And in the relatively short time that I have, I've been asked to talk about the best interests of children and children's rights, and are they consistent or in conflict? And I think this relates to the last presentation in some ways, in that it really asks the question of, do we look at objective, do we have decisions made by adults for children, or do we involve children? What is their subjective preferences, and how do we take account of their views and perspectives? And I think it's clear that children must be involved in decision making about them, and whether the decision making is in the healthcare context, in a social context. I'll be talking a little about the legal context as well. There are a range of contexts. In every context, the views of children are going to be important for making decisions, and there's an obligation on, and I'm looking out here, I don't see too many children here, but I see a lot of adults who are very passionate and who care about children, who want the best for children. But one of the things about we as adults is we have an obligation to engage young people in decisions that are being made about them. And there are at least a number of reasons for this. First of all, they have the legal right, and I'm going to be talking, I'm a law professor, a lawyer, talk about the rights of children, and they're important in and of themselves. And if they're not respected, children might be able to seek legal remedies. But I think more importantly, respecting the rights of children, engaging them in decisions about them, promotes their best interests and often leads to better longer-term outcomes. And particularly as children get older, it becomes impossible to make decisions about them if they don't have some sense that they have ownership of the decision. I will talk a bit about different ways of involving children. Of course, we could spend a whole day on that. There's not one single best way. And as I'll talk, lawyers might have a role in a few cases, but I think it's much more important that other professionals and parents are involved, and indeed that children are directly involved as being advocates for themselves. And I'll conclude by saying a little bit about the duty, the responsibility of professionals, people in this room, to ensure that children are adequately participating in decisions made about them. My focus today is on individual decisions, but I should say there's also a role for children and youth in policy development. And so when we're thinking about enacting laws or developing school codes or other kinds of regulations within social agencies, children and youth should be represented on the bodies that are making decisions. But my focus today is more on individual decision making. And the issue is, why promote children's participation? And one reason certainly is that they have the right, and I'll talk about the source of those rights. Those rights are recognized in domestic law. When I say domestic law, Quebec law, Canadian law, but also internationally, and every country in the world recognizes that children have the right to participate in decisions that affect them. And it's a right of participation. It's not a right necessarily to decide. We have this expression, they have a voice but not a choice. Adults typically have choices. Children have a voice. I think also decision makers are going to make better decisions, whether they're medical treatment decisions or social decisions or decisions about care of children. One of my specialties mentioned is I do a lot of work with families going through divorce and separation. It's particularly important in that context that people are listening to children. Often parents and others are not really listening to what children, how they perceive things. And I think that children will have generally better outcomes if they feel that they have been heard, even if those outcomes are not followed. And I should say, I'll talk a little bit, I've done some research about this in the context of divorce. If children are actually allowed to meet the judge and tell the judge what they want, even if the judge doesn't do what they want, they feel that they were heard and they have better outcomes than if somebody just said, well, we don't need to hear from you, the adults will make this decision without you. And I want to emphasize that while we need to hear from children, they also have the right to say that they don't want to say anything, that they have, if you want, the right to remain silent. But they want to be asked. And by the way, when we survey children in a range of contexts and say, do you think that children in general should be asked about this, starting at a very young age, to say, yes, children should be asked, even though I, as a child, might say, I don't want to actually express a view about this, but in general, children should be asked. And the other thing is, as we start to talk about older children, about teenagers, excuse me, adolescents, unless they're involved and have some degree of acceptance, it's going to be very hard to implement decisions about them. They will, as they say, vote with their feet. Say, oh, I think this is the best thing for you. Unless they're engaged and believe that and are willing to participate, it's not going to be possible to have a successful intervention. And so coming back, talking about what's the legal basis for children's rights, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. I should say this, although it was originally an international document and has been accepted by every country in the world except for the United States. And I should say, by the way, in the United States, although the federal government hasn't recognized, the courts do accept it. It is a part of the law of Canada. Although we say it's international law, it is cited in Canadian courts. It's recognized as applicable and useful in schools and hospitals and courts. And then we also have, in Canada, we have a set of documents about rights, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. In Quebec, you have a Charter of Rights that's sort of an overlap. If this was a conference of lawyers, we could spend the whole day talking about the overlap and tension between the Canadian and Quebec Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But as regards children's rights, they both say similar things, that children have a right to participation, and indeed people have a right of participation regardless of their age. And then we have specific legislation. And each one of you, if you are working in a professional context with children, certainly have to look at your legislative context. The Civil Code, la loi de la protection de la jeunesse.
Youth Protection Act.
They all have specific sections about the rights of children. And of course, in each context, they're a little bit different because they're for a specific context, but more broadly, they recognize and emphasize that children have a right to be consulted, a right to give voice as decisions are being made, and in certain contexts, a right to make decisions. Sometimes people argue, well, children should not be involved in decision making, and this is an ongoing discussion. And certainly, I've been to many conferences and engaged in discussions. Some people, mental health professionals, social workers, doctors say, we shouldn't, it's important that we have some idea what children are thinking, but we should not ask them. We don't want them engaged if there's a disagreement, and here particularly the context of this is parents have separated and they want different things, and they're disagreeing among themselves, and then they're going to court, saying, well, we don't want children caught in the middle between their two people that they love. And that's a valid concern, but I don't think the answer is that they should not be consulted or heard from in any way. There's also related to this a concern that people may be manipulating children. This is not only the divorce context, in abuse context, sometimes people say, well, we believe this child has been sexually abused or physically abused by the parents, but the child is saying they want to go home. We don't want to hear from them because they're just being manipulated or pressured by their parents. And although there is manipulation and pressure sometimes on children, or often, it's not enough to say, well, you're just reflecting your parents' views. You have to say, to what extent do children genuinely incorporate and assess that in their well-being? Another concern that is raised is that children don't understand the decisions that are being made about them. They may understand the process, they may understand the information, medical decision-making, but legal decision-making, so we shouldn't ask them. And the answer is, as you were moving along those kind of scales, we know that children as young as 3, even 2, can start to express views about what's happening. Obviously, the views of a child who are 3 or 4 are very different and much less sophisticated than children who are 15, 16. But if you said you have to have perfect information and understanding to participate, we'd find a lot of adults shouldn't be participating in decisions made about their own lives. So children have a view, they have some information, less, and it may change over time, may be increased. The other concern is, well, particularly in the context of separation, if we ask children to meet with the judge isn't trained to meet with children. Some of you have spent decades learning how to interview children and understand them. Here you have a judge who's been to law school, who may have practiced real estate law, and he's been put on the bench, or she been put on the bench and doesn't know anything about children, and so we shouldn't let them speak to children. And I should say it's interesting, and particularly here in Quebec, and I'll come to this in a moment, the civil code requires that judges who are making decisions about children give children the opportunity to meet with them. And one of the things that I've been involved with doing research with colleague Dr. Francine Cyr at the Université de Montréal is speaking both to children and judges. How do you feel about when children come to meet with you? And many of the judges said, well, I've never met, I guess I have children, but I wasn't trained to do this, and I was a little uncomfortable at first. But after a while, as I started to meet with children, even without much training or any training, I found it very useful and helpful in making the decision. Because otherwise people are coming and arguing before me about what should happen to the child, but I didn't even have the child in front of me. It is helpful to meet the child. And children say they're happy to meet the judge. And I should say, in the context of divorce, one of the things that judges they don't have training about interviewing, but they're told, you make sure you tell the child that I want to hear from you, but I, the judge, am making the decision. And many children feel incredibly relieved just to hear that. And that's the purpose. It's not so just knowing that they have a response, that they're involved, but there's someone else deciding. And then we have, why should children be heard, including meeting with the judge? Point out there's the United Nations Convention. It's certainly clear that most children, or many children, not all children, by the way, and understand, particularly in divorce, but many children want to participate in decisions if you ask them, would you like to have it? And they also understand the difference between being asked, what would you like to have happen, and actually making a decision. That's the story of children's lives. I mean, they say, what would you like to have for Christmas? And they describe something huge, and the parents say, well, that may not happen. It's going to be something different. They say, oh, I understand I had a voice, but I wasn't going to get to choose. And I mean, that's the story of their lives. They rarely get to make a choice, but they like to have a voice. And they want to know what's going on, particularly if you're talking about a situation, a legal situation, a medical situation. They have anxiety, they have fear, what's going to happen in the future. Parents have separated, and no one is talking to the children. Where are they going to live? Where are their pets going to live? What's going to happen to their sports teams and so on? They want to know what's going on. And because the adults involved are so concerned and uncertain, they say, we better not share our uncertainty with children. Children can't handle the uncertainty. It's the adults who can't handle the uncertainty. Children know that life develops, but they want some information. And there's some really interesting research, and certainly more needs to be done about understanding the effects of involvement, but it seems that children have better long-term outcomes if they're involved. And they certainly don't have worse outcomes if they're involved, but I think generally they're having better outcomes. And if there's a dispute, and if the parents are disputing, or parents are arguing with the government, with the social services, if children have a voice, it's more likely to help the parties to come together. And here I mentioned the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child makes very clear that children have the right to express their views in all matters affecting the child. So the 12.1 there is not only about court proceedings, it's about what's going on in schools and hospitals and doctors' offices and social services. They have the right, to the extent they have capacity, to express their own views. And then it goes on to say in legal proceedings, they have a right, and they must be provided an opportunity to be heard in some way, either directly or through a representative. I'll talk about that. In Quebec, among many other provisions, but I just chose one, the Civil Code, of course, says that the court shall, so this is mandatory, in every application affecting the interests of a child, give a child an opportunity to be heard in accordance with his or her age of power and discernment. And so this governs a certain range, all parental separations, but other cases dealt with in the courts, judges have this obligation to say the child has a right to be heard. And as I pointed out, judges may not have much, they may have been real estate lawyers or banking lawyers, whatever, all of a sudden they're appointed judges, they have that obligation. And I should say, judges in Quebec, and I've had the privilege to meet and attend some of their meetings, are willing to do this. And they recognize it's part of their responsibility. And on the whole, I think they do it pretty well. Obviously, they can do more in terms of training education. And these are certainly challenging issues, both for parents who are involved in any kind of decision-making, but also professionals who are involved. How do we involve children? How do we involve children, make sure that they're heard in a way that is sensitive to their needs? and certainly includes the recognition that while children should always be asked and involved, their subjective perceptions, their views, they should also be, there has to be care to make sure they don't feel that they're being caught in the middle, and they certainly have the right to say, I don't want to say something. And they may tell a professional, I'm going to tell you what I want, but I don't want you to I don't want this to be shared. I don't want the decision maker to know, and especially, I don't want my parents to know. They have the right, I think, to tell counselors things that they're saying, and you're not telling my parents. They have, just as adults may tell somebody, this I don't want someone to know, they have the right of that confidentiality. And of course, there's always feedback. Sometimes children want things that are not realistic. And so one has to listen to children and also give them feedback to help them understand the context of what's going on. There's always this question, well, if we're going to listen to children, how much weight, how much account should we take of their views? And the answer, of course, is it depends on a range of factors. Age is a significant, but by no means determinative factor. As I'm sure everyone knows, within any age range, there's tremendous differences in cognitive and emotional, psychological ability, understanding, and so on. And it also depends on the nature of the matter and issue, and what the child is saying and why the child is saying it. And having said that, certainly some children, it's particularly important as they get older to listen to them, because if you don't, they're going to do what they want anyway. And it's important to engage them in an ongoing way, and sometimes repeatedly over time. But certainly with older children, with adolescents, unless they're engaged, they're not going to do what you might consider to be in their best interest in any event. How to engage children? There's a huge, and there's a literature on this, a range of ways. In the legal system, we might say there's direct participation and indirect. Direct means the child actually meets the judge. Indirect might be the child has a lawyer, or maybe makes a videotape statement that the judge hears from. Generally speaking, direct participation is preferable to indirect, but it's also important to recognize others may be advocates for children, and in fact the most frequent advocates by far are parents, and parents can be very good advocates for their children. They're very important advocates. Sometimes they know their children way better than anybody else. Having said that, in certain kinds of contexts, parents are in a position of conflict of interest. Similarly, many of you are in the broad social service sector. You may be good advocates for children in some points, but do you have a conflict of interest? If you're working in a hospital and the hospital has certain institutional policies and the child is saying they want something else, you may have a conflict of interest. I mean, am I the best advocate for the child? Should somebody else be an advocate for the child? Who's going to be ensuring? Should the child be an advocate for themselves? So, by way of conclusion, this is obviously a very broad topic, and I think we'll have time for a little question discussion. There's certainly, I think, if people, as we all are thinking in this room, want to promote the best interests of children, one of the dimensions, there are many dimensions to best interest, but one of them is saying children have a right to participate. And those who are making decisions, and not just necessarily big decisions in court, but other kinds of decisions, are we listening to children about how these things should be done? If we're designing a hospital ward for children, we ask children, if we brought them, we have architects that come in, did we bring in children to talk about what they found about the old ward so we can have a better ward designed? And there's certainly no single best way. And it depends on a range of factors, including the nature of the decision, the age, but also how do the professionals feel? It may be that people say, the architect says, I don't really want children directly, but can you bring in someone who can summarize their views, because it's important that they're the users of this facility. They have we have an understanding of what they're thinking. And it's certainly, depending on an issue, it may be more than one way, and it may well change over time. What this means is certainly there's an obligation also in professional education like this to be thinking about how are we going to hear from children. And having said that, I've been involved, many others are involved in doing research about children's participation in decision making. There's no doubt that more research needs to be done. One of the things that much of my work is in the context of parental separation, although I also do work around criminal court and so on. Even in all those contexts, the tendency for researchers is to say, what are the judges saying? What are the lawyers saying? What are the parents saying? And I try to say, we also have to ask, what are the children's perceptions? If you look at youth justice, for example, corrections, if you look at what's going on, if you read the Canadian Journal of Criminology, almost all of their work is talking to what do the judges say, what do the probation officers say. It's also really important to say, what are the young offenders saying? The youth who are going through the courts, what's their perception of the court process? Children going through divorce, what's their perception of what's going on? And finally, certainly I think, therefore, all of us, but all of you, have a duty to ensure that children are involved in a way that they want and in a way that's appropriate to the context and their age and stage of development. Alors, merci beaucoup. Maintenant, on a
Thank you very much. And